On March 10th, he refused to meet the Lithuanian envoy, but he had a legitimate reason for doing so, feeling so sick that his body looked swollen while his skin was covered in boils. Things were so bad, in fact, that a foul smell emanated from him. It is as if inner turmoil found an external expression. But the envoy could wait. Besides, by now, he's been ruling this land for 5 decades and was used to wielding significant levels of power. The following week, things got so bad that he fell in and out of consciousness. The foreign envoys would have to wait a little longer. Yet, a day later, the famous traditional Russian sauna seemed to bring him back to life. So much so that he returned to the same sauna the following day. He felt well enough to challenge a staff member to a game of chess. As he enjoyed this favorite pastime of his, he suddenly collapsed, fell backward, and died. I am, of course, referring to Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible in the West. And I've already briefly covered the fact that this moniker is incorrect, at least in the modern usage of the English word terrible. A more accurate description of Ivan's moniker would be either formidable or even thundersome, because it comes from, the original Russian comes from the word for thunderstorm, graza. Now, Ivan ruled Russia for a very long time, from 1533 until 1584, but he started when he was a very young boy, around the age of 3, so he actually wasn't the one doing the ruling. This period is a rather fascinating one in Russian history, aren't they all? But if we were to examine it, we'd be here for hours. Obviously, don't threaten me with a good time. At some point when this channel is bigger, I might dedicate a deep dive or two to this subject. So instead, let's briefly have a look at Ivan IV's rule so we can understand him as a man before we look at the way he died and why this has been a controversy for several centuries. First, he began his rule as a grand prince, just like his predecessors, but eventually he started using the term Tsar. He was the first one to do so, and Tsar has a link to the Latin Caesar or Kaiser. So this was sort of an explicit turn towards references to the East Roman Empire, Byzantium at this time, late 15th century, early to mid 16th century, especially after the unfortunate collapse of Constantinople, its final defeat in 1453. Now, some examples include someone like Zoe or Sophia Paleologina from the last Byzantine dynasty. She married Ivan IV's predecessor, Ivan III. Obviously, Byzantine influence started much, much earlier in Russia with Orthodox Christianity, iconography, but it was at this time that the concept of Moscow as the Third Rome was conceptualized more explicitly. For example, this is when the famous dual-headed eagle, the emblem that Russia, a form of which Russia still uses today, was being introduced. Now, think of the Holy Roman Empire, sort of the Western counterpart of the original Rome. The Holy Roman Empire also used a dual-headed eagle, so there was that link between two parts of Rome. During his rule, in terms of foreign policy, Ivan completed the conquest of Kazan, Astrakhan, and he headed into Siberia. Now, that part of what today is present-day Russia had been controlled by the Golden Horde and the descendants of the Golden Horde, the Mongols, for several centuries, and Ivan sort of completed that push of the former rulers of that land out. And as a result, Russia expanded significantly at this time. According to some accounts, it actually exceeded the size of Western Europe at this time. But remember, Europe is just a peninsula of Eurasia. Now, Ivan's foreign policy also involved wars with Europe. For example, there was the very protracted, prolonged Livonian War between 1558 and 1583. One of the points of contention was access to the Baltic. Now, it's important because a lot of the negative information, characterizations, biographic details come from certain Western commentators, travelers, some of whom came from hostile countries with which Russia was at war at this time. So this is sort of an early example of propaganda. At the same time, Ivan was kind of an enlightened ruler in many ways. He financed medical research, astronomers, and other types of science in the capital. He introduced self-government at a local level by reforming public administration. He also reformed the army and the judicial system. He wrote a lot, and not just text, he wrote music. In fact, he was one of the most educated men of his time. He had a penchant for foreign languages, debate, rhetoric. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why I will always have a soft spot for this particular Tsar. He was a badass, and I'm absolutely not sorry. Now, of course, Ivan was not this chill, enlightened hippie who drank his smoothies, did his daily meditations, his positive affirmations. In fact, the second part of his rule was quite ruthless at certain points. For example, he consolidated power by using what was known as oprichnina. He was also known for his temper and rage attacks. On some occasions, he took those out against his servants. Now, the most famous example is the death of his son, one of his sons, whose name was also Ivan. Now, some historians believe that the Tsar struck his son over the head or pushed him, which caused Ivan's death in the context of a heated argument. Others, however, suggest that Ivan died as a result of mercury poisoning. This is a separate rabbit hole, but I will come back to this question at the end of this investigation. But the point here is to show that Ivan IV, the so-called terrible but really the formidable, was a rather multifaceted ruler, even though he was, of course, flawed in terms of his personality. Now, in some cases, his suspiciousness and his temper were, you could say they were somewhat justified because there seemed to be a never-ending court intrigue and a struggle for power within the state and also coming from hostile foreign powers. Also, the executions carried out during his reign, they didn't really exceed some of those in, Western European countries, yet those kings didn't get the moniker terrible. So I think that also shows you this discrepancy between him really kind of being on par or even more humane compared to his Western European counterparts. But be that as it may, let's go back to Ivan's death. Now, right off the bat, there were rumors circulating all around about the unnatural, violent nature of his death as soon as he was gone. Now, he was only 53 years old. Remember, even though he was in power for 5 decades, he didn't actually rule when he was a young child. Chronicles published in the next century after his death made rather audacious claims. And there were 2 most popular culprits that were blamed for Ivan's death, most likely through deliberate poisoning. The first culprit was the man with whom Ivan IV played chess right before he passed. That was Bogdan Belsky. And the second culprit was Boris Godunov, a de facto ruler of Russia during the time of troubles. Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, this is as well as I'm going to pronounce it in Polish, I apologize. He was a prominent military and political leader of the then powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is what he stated, quote, Godunov took the life of Tsar Ivan by bribing the doctor who had treated him. After all, the matter was such that had he not beat him to the punch, he himself would have been executed along with many other prominent nobles. Of course, in his lifetime, Żółkiewski both fought Russia and supported regime change in Russia, so he wasn't exactly an objective observer. At the same time, he was Ivan's contemporary to a certain extent. Now, there was another commentator, Dutch diplomat Isaac Massa. I might be mispronouncing this name, Massa. He actually blamed Belsky, the man with whom Ivan was playing chess right before he died, for poisoning the Russian Tsar. However, this diplomat was born shortly after the Tsar's death, so he wasn't quite a contemporary. So, as you could see, this is somewhat problematic in terms of identifying which one was based on rumors, which one was based on personal biases and prejudices. However, some modern historians have gone as far as to suggest that not only was Ivan deliberately poisoned, but he was strangled on top of this to ensure that he was very, very dead, which is pretty crazy. Interestingly, the Tsar himself seemed to have foreseen his death. Now, it's unclear whether this was a certain foreboding feeling, a premonition, or just the result of his worsening health. Not only did he write his will, leaving the Tsardom to his son Fyodor, the future Tsar, and the city of Uglich to his son Dmitry, who became the prince of that city after Ivan's passing. The Russian Tsar also became a monk shortly before his death. He used the name Iona. Now, the latter is not completely unusual for Russian leaders. I think the most famous example is Alexander Nevsky becoming a monk before his death. So Ivan IV was buried in full monastic garb of a schema monk. Now, these debates and rumors about Ivan's violent death and the manner and cause of his death actually persisted into the 20th century, so for a very, very long time. That is, until 1963, when a team of archaeologists, scientists, and medical examiners actually unearthed his tomb in the famous Archangel Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin in order to carry out a systematic examination of his remains. The team tested Ivan's body for common poisons that would leave evidence long after a person's death. Now, of course, this is somewhat limited. I'm not a medical professional or a scientist. I imagine, though, that there would be some plant poisons, perhaps something like the death cap mushroom, that might not leave evidence in the bones. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the team that did the best that they could at the time. So, they concluded that arsenic content in Ivan was normal, but that mercury levels were much higher than the norm. However, they suggested that because the Tsar was said to have suffered from many illnesses, he took several types of medications, and at the time, some medications unfortunately included mercury. Now, the examination also claimed to debunk the strangulation hypothesis. They stated that the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone were not snapped, which would have happened in a deliberate case of strangulation, that is, murder by using this method. It was intact. It was also then that the famous Russian anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov actually reconstructed Ivan's appearance by using his skull, and the world saw what the man actually looked like, or may have looked like, based on sort of more scientific methods rather than manuscript illuminations. Now, Gerasimov described Ivan as having a serious case of osteophytes, which was unusual for a man in his early 50s. But that's not the end of the story. Later, Dr. Tatyana Panova, the chief archaeologist and historian of the Moscow Kremlin, who specializes in medieval Russia and specifically necropolises of medieval Russia, carried out her own studies starting from the 1990s and into the present. A recent work of hers from 2017, for instance, is called The Role of Poison in the Struggle for Power in Russia from the 11th to the 17th century. So, of course, that makes her a leading specialist in this very specialized field, right? The usage of poisons. Now, Panova suggested very different things in contrast to the 1963 investigation. She arrived at very different conclusions. So first, she stated that the arsenic content in Ivan's bones was actually at least double that of a permissible amount. So she believes that someone was feeding Ivan regularly this cocktail of mercury and arsenic in order to deliberately cause his death through poisoning. And the result of that, of course, was his untimely death in his early 50s. In 2018, Russia's Joint Institute for Nuclear Research, along with Panova and her team, carried out a systematic investigation by using neutron activation analysis of 3 people related to Ivan. The first one was his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, one of his sons, Ivan, that I mentioned in the beginning of this video, and Prince Skopin-Shuysky. Neutron activation analysis uses the measurement of gamma rays that come from a sample that had been bombarded by neutrons. Put simply, it measures the concentration of the relevant elements in a precise way. Conclusion? Anastasia's remains confirmed, quote, an acute mercury poisoning, while those of Ivan's son Ivan and Prince Skopin-Shuysky showed an increased mercury content in their remains. Now, women at the time, of course, used mercury as part of medicines and as part of cosmetics, but the amount that was found of that substance in Anastasia's hair far exceeded that type of daily use. So, she was only 27 years old when she died, and thus the investigation team believes that she was deliberately poisoned as part of court intrigue and the struggle for power. Similarly, Skopin-Shuysky was only about 23 years old. He was fit, he was athletic, and his contemporaries described his death as a result of a poisoning at a dinner party, which was accompanied by significant gastrointestinal symptoms. Now, Ivan's son Ivan would have used mercury-based medicines for years, so the team thinks that he developed, quote, chronic poisoning as a result of this type of, medical treatment. However, he died from blunt force trauma in his mid-20s. Now, this is the rabbit hole that I mentioned at the beginning. It's unclear what the reasoning for this is, because the 1963 investigation stated that his skull was in really poor shape and they really couldn't determine his manner and cause of death. And the only thing that this 2018 paper mentions is blunt force trauma, but it doesn't really go farther into detail. So I would say this question is still not conclusively decided. But that's not the end of the story either. In late 2021, Russian media announced that that same institute would carry out that same kind of analysis of the Tsar's remains. They would be immersing his bone samples in a stream of neutrons, so to speak, forming radioactive isotopes, and ultimately measuring the gamma ray radiation and identifying the relevant substances. So this method should, in theory, confirm or reject the idea that Ivan IV was deliberately poisoned, that is, murdered. But as of now, I've been unable to find any further information about the subject. The paper is not on the Institute's website, unlike the previous one that I accessed and read for the purposes of researching this topic. And so it's unclear whether they hadn't done the investigation yet or whether the paper hadn't been published. So the jury is still out on this question. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting, sort of true crime meets Russian history meets modern science. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas about this topic in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.